Welcome to week 7 of our course, Economic Evaluation in Global Health. This week we shall look at cost of illness studies, and you'll find them referred to as burden of disease studies, burden of disease. And while they aren't very common, especially in global health, I think they are an important aspect of economic evaluation, and we'll spend some time this week learning about them. The aims this week are to understand the different types of cost of illness studies that are available in the literature and to recognize them once you see them. So if you read, you'll find papers that say that the burden of disease in some place, in some country for a certain disease is X dollars. And I would hope that by the end of this week, you'll be able to decide which method of estimating this X dollars burden of disease was. As in other weeks, we'll divide this week into 3 parts. In the first part, we'll look at an introduction to cost of illness methods. In part 2, we'll look at some examples from the global health literature. And finally, we'll look at cost of illness study, an example using a model. And this is a study that I participated in performing and reporting. So think about everything we learned in week 3. In which we discussed costs. We discussed costs, estimating costs for purposes of performing a cost effectiveness or a cost utility or whatever economic evaluation you are doing. All the lessons learned in week 3 apply to estimating the cost of illness. So you can divide the costs into, for example, direct medical costs, direct non-medical costs, and indirect costs. But the difference between week 3 and this week is that in week 3 we are doing the cost estimation for purposes of doing an economic evaluation, and we saw that economic evaluation is the comparative analysis of 2 or more options with regard to their costs and consequences. And in cost of illness, the aim is to assess burden of disease. Like I said, it's to assess the burden of a given disease, burden of disease. So the aim of doing the analysis is different in cost of illness than in the general estimation of costs for performing economic evaluations. And this week we're going to spend our time looking at how this difference comes about. Cost of illness studies are important tools for quantifying the public health or general population economic burden associated with a disease. And it need not be a disease, it might be an illness or an injury, maybe like road traffic accident, or a risk factor for a disease. Like I said, they're also called burden of disease studies, and they're important in advocacy. They're very important for advocacy because they raise awareness about the impact of diseases on the use of scarce healthcare resources in a particular community. So they are comparative tools as well. They quantify the impact of one disease relative to another disease or relative to a set of other diseases. And they can help policymakers set priorities, to make resource allocation decisions, and to plan for healthcare services. The ideal cost of illness study includes all relevant individuals and tries to isolate the costs that are specifically due to the disease of interest. So it tries to isolate disease-specific costs, and it tries to calculate and monetize direct costs, which are linked to diagnosis, treatment, and management of the disease, indirect costs, which are productivity losses due to mobility and premature mortality, and then intangible costs, which are to do with the loss of length or quality of life due to other factors like pain and suffering. And these ones, like we saw in week 3, can be quite difficult to monetize. And also, like in week 3, you can have multiple perspectives, including the societal, which is the all-inclusive perspective. But you can have the governmental, the healthcare system, and some people do studies that are specific to a certain employer, the cost of illness or the burden of disease to an employer. And you can have a patient groups or even the patient perspective. So to perform a cost of illness study, you can do a total cost study or an incremental cost study. So there are 2 kinds of cost of illness study, a total cost study and an incremental cost study. And a total cost study estimates the total expenditure of people diagnosed with a disease of interest. And this kind of study has no comparison group. And there are two methods for doing this. One is called the SUM-all, and the other one is the sum diagnosis specific costs method. So one is SUM-all and the other is sum diagnosis specific cost method. And then you have the incremental cost studies, the incremental cost method. And in this one, you estimate the increase in costs that is solely attributable to the presence of that specific disease that you're interested in. And you can do this comparison by using a matched control method or using regression methods. And we'll see examples of this. So essentially, the incremental cost studies need a comparison group. Let's now look at the SUM-all medical costs method. In this method, you need to identify all the patients with a disease of interest and then add up their health expenditures. And this is regardless of whether they relate to the disease of interest or not. And it's easy because it requires only a diagnosis of the disease. So it has strength and simplicity. And it's good for diseases with relatively trivial non-disease costs. So a patient with AIDS, which is the advanced form of HIV, most costs associated with that state of health are probably to do with the HIV. So it's good for such diseases. But it's not good for diseases that happen in the context of multiple comorbidities like Alzheimer's. Patients with Alzheimer's are usually relatively older and they have issues like arthritis, they might have diabetes, they might have cancer or be cancer survivors. So if you have these comorbidities, then chances are you'll overestimate the costs. You'll overestimate the cost of the disease. Now, if you're doing cross-country comparisons and you're interested in relative statements comparing countries, then this SUM-all medical costs method can be ideal because you are not interested in absolute statements. You're interested in comparing one area to another or one country to another. Let's look at the sum diagnosis related costs method. And like in the SUM-all costs method, you identify patients with the disease of interest, but you only sum the costs that are related to the disease of interest. And if you do this, you may underestimate cost of illness if you fail to include some individuals or if you neglect spillover costs. So if you have an MI, for example, if you have a myocardial infarction, you might not count its cost in diabetes mellitus, but you'll count it in hypertension. You might not count in diabetes, but count it in hypertension. And yet we know that diabetes affects the risk of having an MI. The other one is that if you have Alzheimer's, you might have dementia-related fractures and pneumonia, but dementia is not considered to be a cause of these problems. So you can underestimate the cost of illness. Sometimes both methods, the SUM-all costs and the sum diagnosis-related costs methods, can achieve similar results. And we already talked about how HIV, the advanced form of HIV, AIDS, if you have any sort of cost estimates for that health state or that disease, they are likely related to that disease. So the SUM-all costs method and sum diagnosis related costs method might have similar results in this case. The other method is the matched control group method. Again, you identify a group of patients with the diagnosis of interest, and then you identify a control group and you match the patients with the disease of interest to the control group, and you use demographic and clinical characteristics. And you hope that matching achieves sufficient control. And then you calculate the mean sum of medical costs among the patients of interest and subtract the mean sum of medical costs from the controls. And it's good to have a homogeneous case mix in terms of things like disease stage and comorbidities, and this improves the accuracy of the method. The next method of doing cost of illness studies is to use regression analysis. And if you use regression analysis, the estimate of cost of illness comes from the coefficient of an indicator variable for the diagnosis of the disease of interest. Once you build the regression model. So the coefficient is what gives an estimate of the cost of illness. And regression adjusts for confounding factors. And you can use direct control in a statistical model, or you can do control using matching. The advantage is that you have additional control for confounding when you use regression methods. But the disadvantage is that you need to take care of the underlying distribution of cost. And sometimes you need advanced regression techniques because of the underlying distribution of costs. So costs can have unpredictable distributions, and you need to take care of those before you execute a regression analysis on cost data. Looking at the number of cost of illness studies in the literature and the methods that they use, of the 4 methods we've discussed, which is regression, matched control, sum diagnosis specific, and sum all, you'll see that the sum diagnosis specific seems to be the biggest group in these gray bars, in these shaded bars, the ones I'm marking, these ones. But another thing you can see from this picture is that compared to other kinds of studies, cost of illness studies are actually rare. So in 1996 you had less than 20, and now you have 80 studies or something like that these days. So they are increasing, but compared to, say, cost effectiveness analysis, they are still relatively limited. But it seems that up till now, the sum diagnosis specific costs method is the most common. The other way to look at cost of illness studies is through the prism of prevalence-based methods, prevalence-based and incidence-based. So prevalence-based methods measure the costs burden, the economic cost burden, over a specific time period. Maybe it's just 1 year. And you include the medical care and mobility costs of the disease in that time period. And you can estimate the number of cases of death and hospitalization attributable to that disease in the given year, and then assign them the costs independent of the first occurrence of the disease. So it doesn't require you to estimate incidence. So by doing that, you include patients from across the disease spectrum. If you have So the sample includes very sick patients and relatively well patients. So it includes patients from different stages of the disease. Usually it can be the only option if the disease lasts a long time and you don't have a way to capture the long-term consequences of the disease. It also generates estimates that can draw attention to policymakers because the time period appeals to them. Policymakers usually think in 1 or 2 year time frames, and this type of analysis that limits to a single year usually appeals to policymakers. And you can also use estimates from this design, the prevalence-based method, to design cost containment policies. Switching to the incidence-based cost of illness studies, these ones estimate economic burden from the onset of the disease to the end of the disease. And the end of the disease is either death of patients or cure of the disease. And they estimate burden of disease by first identifying a bunch of new cases, incident cases. Maybe this happens in a given year. And then following them and measuring the discounted lifetime medical, mobility, and mortality costs associated with those patients. So you need new cases and you need to follow them up over the lifetime of the disease to measure incidence-based cost of illness. And incidence-based cost of illness is particularly important when considering preventive measures. So you want to estimate the savings that you would achieve by preventing the disease. It's also important if you're considering interventions that happen across the lifetime of the disease. So interventions for multiple stages of a disease. And maybe as a last point, both the incidence and prevalence-based methods can be performed prospectively or retrospectively. This marks the end of part 1 of week 7, and in part 2 we're going to look at some examples of cost of illness studies that have been performed and reported in the literature. Thank you very much, and see you in part 2 of week 7.